Walking through a certain dilapidated inner-city neighborhood in a working-class northern town, you'll notice that there is a chance that you will come upon a terrace street that is unlike any other, but it is quite unlikely. That's because Purgatory Street doesn't actually exist, at least in theory, not in our plane of existence, and no map will show it, and no local will discuss it, with only whispers of its existence can be heard by outsiders in the back rooms of working men's clubs, bingo halls, and greasy spoon cafes. But it has taken on a life of its own and is now an urban legend throughout the northern villages and cities, where tales finally find their way to people like me via strange internet forums. I consider myself to be an amateur paranormal and urban explorer. Investigator, the most of my friends and family believe that I am wasting my life and have too much free time. Following years of dead ends and searching for gulls and ghosts in deserted houses and dim country alleys, disappointments, I considered quitting my odd pastime at times, but I decided to go for a walk, and I would like to state that there is some set of laws or magic that transformed my life forever. Method that you can use to go to the street if there's a road that nobody's ever been able to recognize it in the actual world. It's wasteland, an empty lot covered in gravel. It's unknown who owns the land because it's overrun with weeds, vermin, and other trash. No private developer has ever attempted to construct on the land, and the council has no involvement in it. You'll get a stony response from locals regarding the land. It seems like there's a conspiracy among the locals to conceal this sinister secret from the public, and they would respond angrily anytime when someone like me approaches and begins to ask questions. There is no specific time or date that you can show up, and some claim that Wasteland miraculously changes into the paranormal street of legend, that you are chosen by the street, which only permits a few people to stroll its cobblestones. In any event, 999 out of if you go there 1,000 times, you'll only see weeds and heaps of discarded garbage, but I persisted in spite of several setbacks throughout the years. Returning, I suppose something drew me back there, and my perseverance paid out in the end, although as you should be cautious about what you desire, for since you might, just on a chilly Saturday night. It was nearly midnight when the street finally revealed to me that I was so worn out from working a double shift at my day job that I nearly skipped going that evening. But I survived the weather and dragged myself to the location, and upon seeing it, the stretch of wasteland was gone, and my heart nearly sprang out of my chest. 2 rows of red brick terraced residences on a roadway with vintage cobblestones have mysteriously taken their place. And faintly lit by gas lamps, it seemed as though I was gazing back in time at a working-class street from the industrial era, although I wasn't very worried about this. The street's entrance seemed to be a clear liquid, like gateway that led to a different realm or plane of existence. I stood there for a while, not believing what I was seeing. When I became aware that I was viewing another world, I was momentarily sidetracked by the joyful noises. So I turned back and looked across the actual street, where as I stood there, I noticed a young couple stumbling along the sidewalk, perhaps coming home from a night out, glanced at me with suspicion while sniggering, and whispered to one another as they went by. I understood that if they had been able to see what I could, they would have responded. I waited till the inebriated pair had realized that this vision was only for me, slipped out of view before returning to the enigmatic street. For a brief moment, I wasn't sure how to, unfortunately. The reports I read from the few people who said they had been to Purgatory Street were usually ambiguous, so it was unclear how to access and leave the membrane's magical realm. Or whatever it was, it appeared welcoming, but looks can be deceiving, and I felt like turning since I wasn't sure if I could cross across securely and return. I discovered that Purgatory Street did, in fact, exist after I turned around and left. Maybe this was enough, but I knew I couldn't give up now that I had come this far. Now I inhaled deeply, moved forward gingerly, raised my arm, and I inserted my palm through the barrier and watched in wonder as the surface shook like a water pond that has been smashed by. I was relieved to see my hand on the other side of the falling pebble still attached to. With my body feeling comfortable, I kept walking while completely immersing myself in the liquid. Membrane, I was unable to breathe for a moment and thought the worst. But then I was relieved to breathe the air as I came out on the other side and stepped out onto Purgatory Street's cobblestones. I had the feeling that it was different from my reality in some way, but I wasn't sure why, so it was still a case of wonderful. But I had to make sure I could return now that I had crossed over. I took a step back without looking back, and then another one, going through the portal once more before I was worried that I wouldn't be able to return when I found myself back on the actual street in the mortal realm. But fortunately, this was not the case, and I was able to cross and return without any issues. As a result, following all these years of initially, I was thrilled to have at last found something remarkable, but I was anxious as well because I had no idea what was in store for me or how long the gateway would be open. But I was resolved to investigate the street and learn its mysteries, so I proceeded right away. And this is what it's challenging to see the street itself, because it truly feels like a throwback to a bygone period. To accurately situate it within the historical framework, because there are several, when you first enter the road, you will notice rows of 2 up, 2 down terrace residences on either side. Their front doors open directly onto the pavement on the side of the street. Although I'm not sure who maintains them, the lamps that light up the road seem to be gas-powered rather than electric. There are 2 notable establishments close to the homes, a backstreet pub and a corner store. These are the kinds of tiny at first look. The street appears charming and almost idyllic, with businesses that are regrettably disappearing in the modern world. Look, but this small hamlet has a lot of dark secrets, as I've already shown. Outlined how the street's top serves as a doorway that leads back to our world at the other end. But that was a mystery. But when I glanced down the road, I noticed a dense fog starting just after the previous gas station. Lighting. It created a dense layer that I was unable to see through, and the thought of what was underneath was unsettling. The opposite side of the fog. But this presented a challenge because later on, I cautiously made my way down the dark, lighted street, feeling more and more nervous as I went along. I had the impression that being observed by adversaries, and I profess that I could make out the shadowy silhouette of. I flinched when I noticed a pair of shadowy individuals standing close beyond the drapes. A visage appeared out of the shadows, a ghostly white face that made the drapes flutter. I flinched in terror when I saw the horrible visage and dark shark-like eyes glaring out at me, yet was unable to turn away. It seemed as though those evil eyes were keeping me in a daze and going against all of my instincts. Physique. I found myself moving slowly in the direction of the window and paying close attention as through the glass, the monster spoke softly, repeating the same line repeatedly with its scarlet lips. Spoke in a low, artificial voice, saying, "You don't belong here." It yelled so loudly on the third that you don't belong here. The thing cackled cruelly at my back as I slid backwards onto the cobbles, landing roughly. Unfortunately, I looked at the portal door and briefly thought about escaping back to my own planet. But I didn't. In the stories I had read and heard of ghostly realms like this, frequently shielded by a harbinger, a supernatural being entrusted with frightening guests away from the world of mortals, would deliberately want to frighten someone like me. But the myths claim they are unable of causing us any bodily harm, so I hoped the stories were true, and they inspired bravery to confront the beast and drive it out of this area. Snapped. "No," I said resolutely, "not until I'm finished." It responded angrily. For a brief while it hissed like an enraged cat, its eyes enlarging and its fangs showing. As I pictured the beast crashing through the thin glass and consuming me there, I realized I had made a grave error on the cobbles, but instead it backed away, growling in front of it once more. I glanced back to the street and reacted as it vanished beyond the faded drapes, letting out a sigh of relief. I was somewhat aback to see two old women standing on the sidewalk, intently observing me. Their skin was aged and their hair was white, but they were wearing bulky winter coats and had shawls over their heads. The women's eyes were full of intellect and expression, and I observed how both carried wicker shopping baskets were placed on the pavement outside the entrance of the store, wrapped with kitchen towels. "Good for you, son." Number 7 cried out the "You're doing well" woman for confronting that disgusting thing. I quickly understood that she was referring to my experience with the entity in number when he was taken down a peg or two. 3 and questioned what she knew about it, but I was hesitant to ask. "Thank you," I muttered as I carefully approached them across the cobbles. Both women appeared to be sufficiently amiable, smiling and waving at me. But this was not at all typical, and I had a suspicion that the elderly women were not what they seemed to be. But I had already entered this quest with knowledge of the dangers, and I'm Mavis. The first woman stated, feeling like these women could give me some answers. "And this is Alice. It's good to meet you, young man." I grinned and nodded. "It was nice to meet you too." "Do you live on the streets?" I asked, and Mavis chuckled, before responding, "Yeah, young man. We've been homeless for a very long time." I nodded in agreement as Mavis and Alice reminded me that not much occurs around here without our knowledge. I was reminded of local gossipers, the people who would constantly stand on a street corner and observe all the arrivals. "And you're not from here, son, did you?" ask Alice, despite the fact that I said, "No." I already knew the answer to her question. Reluctantly, I said, "I'm from back there," pointing to the entrance at the top of the. Alice bowed her head in apparent puzzlement as I asked whether they could see what I saw. "We haven't had somebody from that side visit us in a while, so I understand that you're from the opposite side." Anticipated follow-up inquiries, but instead Mavis and Alice exchanged a glance, and I noticed a strained, unhappy expression in their eyes. Before I broke the silence, there was a pause. "Do you enjoy living here?" was a dumb question, but it still got a response, and the two women started a lively discussion while Alice gasped with her elderly eyes. "I almost forgot I was here. This used to be a nice street, but it's not anymore. Once, when you were filled with a mix of rage and passion, you could stroll alone with your doors unlocked. I'm afraid it's after dark now." Oh, Mavis did agree while nodding her head. She knows that Mr. Smith at number 13 has lost everything. Humiliating her friend's response. "He beats his wife and children after drinking." Don't get me wrong, it's not only that. What about Sally in the pub? She suffered a horrible tragedy, but she has since completely lost her mind. You're exactly accurate. What about Mr. Rusht? He once owned a reputable business. But let me tell you that there is something really odd about that man, and I will not be returning to his store. You don't have me either, and let's not even talk about that young jerk from number 33. Did you know that, thanks to God, he's now known as Billy the Kid? I guess there was no discipline in that home, because they watched too many of those fucking Western movies. They let him to go amok, frightening the entire street. Where will this end? This deluge of knowledge almost burned my exhausted brain, so I needed to get additional details regarding the street and its residents, but luck was on my side since I caught a glimpse of the missile ducking out of the corner of my eye. Then, intuitively, I heard glass breaking as it just missed my head. I glanced about against the cobblestones and noticed a little guy, perhaps 11 or 12, he wore shorts, a peaked cap, a ruffled blouse, and a large scarf around his neck. His eyes were evil as he chuckled, but I think he was upset that the bottle he'd acquired had. When the hurled object missed its mark, Mavis yelled angrily and waved her fist at the boy. Alice soothed her companion, saying, "Damn you, Billy, you're a bloody menace." Saying, "Come on, Mavis, let's go inside before it gets worse." After firmly placing a hand on her arm, that they slammed the door behind them and fled into number 7, leaving me by myself on the stunned by the woman's abrupt exit. I gave the boy a furious look, only to be I became angry when I was given a one-fingered salute and heard more derisive laughter. The youngster began to run as I yelled, "You little bastard, come here," and I naively followed after him, not to consider the possibility that I might have been snagged. I followed him as he darted into a doorway and vanished from view, just momentarily raising my head to see the sign. Above the door, Mr. Rashid's newsagents and grocers were displayed, and I observed the piled cans and tiny flags newspapers that were on display at the store's window. I went through the door and looked around the shop in a panic, but I couldn't find the boy. Billy the Kid, however, was now the least of my worries. That there was a serious issue with this corner store that soon made clear. To the first thing that struck me was the terrible stench of rot and decay, so terrible that I nearly felt mesmerizing before realizing I was being, as I slowly turned around. I noticed a man who I assumed to be Mr. Rashid, middle-aged South Asian man with a beard and a broad, artificial smile which appeared to have been painted on his face. This was unsettling, but what's more worrying, I saw that the striped apron he wore over his clothing was blood-stained. Spots, but the store owner, Mr. Rashid, who owned a grocery store rather than a butcher shop, welcomed me, pleasantly, at least outwardly, but I could sense that there was a sinister undertone to his "Good evening, sir. Welcome to my modest shop. How may I be of assistance to you?" His greeting caught me off surprise today, and I briefly found it difficult to find the right words to answer. I noticed a young child racing through the street, and he tossed a bottle at me. Mr. Rashid shook his head as he passed by, his smile never fading. "Goodness gracious, no sir. We don't let troublemakers in here," he replied. "Facility, but while you're here, why don't you look at our fresh produce and see if anything grabs your attention? I promise that we have the greatest pricing in town." I nearly burst out laughing as I soon discovered why the stalls smelled so awful after looking around the interior. The fruit in Mr. Rashid's stock was in a state of deterioration and was far from fresh. The milk was sour and curdled, the veggies were brown and decaying, and the shop's inside was a complete mess, with the labeled cans dented and the old newspapers yellow and decaying, or busted open. And remarkably, Miss Rashid appeared completely unaware of the disaster. He kept his little smile on his lips while standing behind the till, surrounded by stench and general mayhem. But I could tell the stink worsened as I waited for a horrible secret to be disclosed. As I moved down the aisle, I noticed an old white object at the store's back. I assumed the refrigerator was broken because the fresh smell of rotting meat greeted my nostrils. As I got closer, I turned to find Mrs. Rashid observing my now clear uneasiness. I asked him, "What's inside here?" Behind his normally friendly look, the store owner reluctantly replied, "Take a look inside if you so desire," and his smile wavered for the first time. I felt obligated to open the refrigerator door, even though I really didn't want to. I accomplished this by carefully rotating the chilly metal handle while reaching out with a trembling hand. I opened the door and flinched in terror when I saw that the shelves were crammed with rotten meat, with a broken fridge mechanism and dark and maggot-infested flies. But despite how repulsive the appearance and smell were, this was not the cause of my disgust, and since there were arms, legs, internal organs, and the human head's mouth is open and wiggling, and its eyes are missing from their sockets. I turned my back on the disgusting scene and scowled back at Mr. Maggots, wretchedly withdrawing in disgust. I kept staring at Rashid, whose face was now etched with humiliation and sorrow, in unwillingness to speak as he stammered out his confession, "You must trust me." He wiped the perspiration from his brow. "I'm not a murderer. I never intended for this to happen. Prior to proceeding, I arrived in this nation with the intention of beginning a company and earn enough cash to host my family. But the demands that he pointed fiercely at the mutilated, saying, loneliness was too much for me. I caught this man in the ACT after he broke into my shop late one night and left a corpse in the refrigerator, stealing until we got into a fight, and I suppose my rage got the better of me. He bowed his head, unable to look me in the eye, and I knew the cops would never trust me, so I promised to dispose of the body. You have to believe me, sir. Mr. Rashid was crying as he ended his speech, saying, "This was never my intention. I'm sorry, but after hearing his awful story, I couldn't speak. Confession, what did he want from me in terms of forgiveness or atonement? He didn't. Instead, my only goal was to get out of this terrible corner store. Consequently, I glanced beyond the distraught Mr. Rashid and toward the door, where I was afraid he refused to let me leave even though I now knew the truth. But a half-brick broke through the store, creating a distraction. Window pelting the room with jagged pieces of glass. Mr. Rashid cried out as though in agony. I took advantage of the opportunity to run, so please leave me alone. Billy was waiting for me as I ran for the door and back onto the street, leaving the death and odor behind me. The child kept making fun of me when I realized that he had thrown the brick that had broken Mr. Rashid's window. I followed him as he ran down the cobblestones. Even though I was no longer angry with children, I was able to leave Mr. Rashid's shop thanks to the boy's brick attack, and I now questioned if he was leading me down the street in a manner akin to a hybrid of a hooligan and a fairman. In any case, I chose to continue following the child despite my anxiety of where he would take me. I observed as the halfway down the street, I ran into a doorway, but I stopped before going inside after noticing the sign above the entrance, which the swing door was closed, the windows were frosted, and the bucket of blood was red. As the boy vanished inside, I quickly discovered that, in spite of its unattractive name, this establishment functioned as the neighborhood public house, a backstreet boozer similar to those seen in working-class neighborhoods. Based on my prior experiences, I was unsure of what to anticipate when I walked through the door of the pub. Opened, I was first struck with the scent of old booze and tobacco smoke, not the most enticing of scents, but unquestionably better than the rotting and rot at the corner store at first appearance. The pub's decor was rather unremarkable, with clean tiny booths, wooden fixtures, and a bar piled high with the walls were adorned with vintage black and white photos of beer pumps and liquor bottles. Dark-faced employees and their families all appeared to be looking down at me with a slightly menacing expression. 3 burly men were the only customers in the mostly deserted barroom, drinking at the bar's end, all of them sporting filthy overalls and sporting glum expressions as they took sips from their pints. They disregarded me, and when I approached the bar, I was welcomed by the "What are you doing this evening" proprietor. I turned to face her, serving me a pretty woman in her mid to late 30s who wore cosmetics, and she gave me a kind wink while wearing a dark skirt and a white lace shirt, her blonde hair styled in a tidy bun. With a smile, her eyes were emerald and intense, but her hospitable manner seemed to be tinged with grief, and I knew she had experienced tragedy in the past, but I still took the land. Taking a stool and responding with a pint of bitter, the woman accepted her offer. "Please, sure thing." Sweetheart, she smiled, picked up a fresh glass and poured my beer. "You're Sally?" I questioned shyly, recalling that she responded to the old woman's discussion that I am, and we've been waiting for you, my love. I replied bewildered, but news spreads quickly. She placed the pint on the bar in front of me, and we don't often receive visitors from the opposite side of the street. "Thank you," I said, not a word. "On the house, love problem." "Love, but keep in mind that this is a neighborhood boozer, and that we're a close, knit group that looks out for one another. I'm not saying that you're not welcome, love, but please make sure that you act appropriately." Her expression had become more antagonistic, and I could sense that she was warning me. I found it difficult to respond. But Sally had already turned away from me and was staring at a framed picture that was hanging behind the bar when I looked across. The photo of a contented and smiling Sally on a beach made me feel as though I was prying into a private moment. There were two little children in swimwear, a boy and a girl. Giggling next to her, she had a tear in her eye as she viewed the picture, and I was curious about the background of the suddenly. The pub door suddenly sprang open, and a newcomer walked in. I noticed a dark-haired man wearing work overalls who was muscular and had a rugged, excellent appearance. He smiled as he approached the bar with a haughty demeanor, strode to his seat, and placed his order for the evening. "Sally, my sweetheart." The landlady gave him a little glance before answering, as is customary. "Okay, Neil, do you understand me? I just don't want any difficulty tonight." He winked at Sally and shrugged his shoulders, saying, "You know me, darling. I'll be as good as gold." Sally snorted, but she still gave him his pint, and I was starting to feel a little guilty, feeling from this guy, and attempted to ignore his gaze. But Neil turned to face me and began a chat. "Hi friend, I'm Neil Smith. You must be this guy from the We've all heard a lot about the other side, and I can affirm that that's me. I'm curious how everyone on this street knew everything about me. Welcome to the neighborhood, my friend," he chuckled, "but I must warn you, it's bloody dead around here." Loudly at his own joke while I grinned clumsily. Neil then looked across from Sally, who was once more engrossed in the family portrait behind the bar. He was still living in the past. I believe the landwoman gave him a glare as he growled, "It's time you moved on." She retreated to the back room and spat out her irate bottle, saying, "Go to hell, Smith." Neil grinned and pointed up at the picture, asking, "Are those her kids?" Neil retorted, "Jesus," I saw suddenly. The poor blighters died in a fire, acknowledged that it was a tragedy, and showed some empathy for the landlady's suffering. Neil shakes his head. "I know it would be awful to lose because I have children of my own. You should still observe what old Sally did to the boy who set the 'don't worry about that' blaze. She obtained justice for the rest of us." He chuckled once again. I noticed a nasty look on his face as he gulped down his pint and gazed at it. "How is your pint?" he said. "Okay," and I replied bewilderedly, even though I hadn't actually touched my drink. "And go, buddy. I'm tired of this shit water. I've worked hard all day to support my family, and this is what I receive, Sally." I was astounded by Neil's level of rage, had turned into the landlady, who had gone into a rage over something as insignificant as a pint of beer, hurried out of the back room, confronting her combative client directly. "What's up, Smith? The pint is gone, and I want a fresh one." Neil slammed his pint and said, "There's nothing wrong with my beer. Quit complaining." He screamed his next words through clenched teeth as he fell heavily on the wooden bar, spilling about a third of the liquor. "Get me a fresh pint, teeth. You're bloody." I was shocked by how quickly this had intensified, but I observed as a stony-faced Sally steadily raised the pint glass above the. After Neil recovered from his fright, he was seated and the contents were emptied over his head. When he threw himself across the bar and reached for Sally's throat, I leaped from my chair, believing I had to step in, but a second later, the three drinkers violently grabbed Neil, who had abruptly leaped from their chairs, and the guys began punching and thrashing Neil. Neil kicked him mercilessly, causing his blood and teeth to spill onto the wooden floor. Sally yelled, "Get that bastard out of my life," as the men pulled him to the boozer's back door. I was appalled by the abrupt turn toward violence, but far worse was just a second later, the pub's front glass window broke and a firebomb was hurled inside, crashing upon the wooden bar and immediately lighting it up. "Oh my God, please, don't do that again," Sally screaming as she was overcome by utter terror. The fire quickly spread, and the barroom was loaded with smoke. I remained low and coughed a lot as the smoke got inside my lungs. However, I managed to make it to the door and back out onto the street, where Billy was naturally waiting for me. However, as he watched the fire spread, he appeared extremely sorry rather than ridiculing or laughing for once. He ran away as he noticed me, and I immediately followed, Observing him vanish into another doorway was open, and when I glanced at the house number, I found that it was number 13. This is not good. Stood on the sidewalk for a while before a big person came out to welcome me, and I was shocked to see a face I knew. Neil Smith darkened the doorway. He gave me a disapproving glance that I had just witnessed, losing his former charm. He had been battered nearly to death, but he was now unmarked, and he also made no reference to our prior interaction just minutes prior. Even though he seemed to recognize me. "Here you are," he continued, his voice hardly masking the animosity. "You'd better come in." I didn't want to follow him inside because I had already seen the man's before the MS started serving meals. Violence sighed, but I had to go to number 13 and confront whatever horrors were there. I was somewhat aback by what I discovered inside, since I was faced by an oak dining table. There was a lad of approximately 14 or 15 sitting where a family was waiting to eat, and a girl younger than 10 years old. Both looked somewhat like Neil Smith. So the two kids glanced up at me with suspicion, thinking they were his kids, while their father took his position at the head of the table. No introductions were given, and I felt uneasy around them. When Neil's wife entered from the kitchen carrying a hefty copper pot, the unease only grew. She was a young lady with a lovely face and beautiful, dark hair, yet she, Mrs. Smith, who appeared worn out and disheveled, was shocked to see me leaping, and nearly she cautiously glanced at her husband after dropping her pot and inquired, "Who's your friend?" Neil, her spouse, gave me a stern look as he said, "GK," a guest on the opposite side said, "His wife," as though this one I took a seat at the end of the table after making an the cuff remark that addressed all of her inquiries. I watched anxiously as Mrs. Smith used a ladle to open the cooking pot and pour out a stew of boiling potatoes and pork. Thanked her while heaping the food onto my plate. The stew looked like it had been prepared, but it did not look tasty, from terrible and cheap cuts in addition to the graphic scenes I had seen in Miss. I had lost any hunger I might have had after visiting Rashid's business, and the sight and scent of the fortunately. Nobody seemed to mind that I wasn't eating because everyone in the family was engrossed in their food, and after a few minutes of eating quietly, Neil suddenly spat out a piece of tough meat onto his plate. "Damn you, lady," he said angrily, focusing his rage on his patient wife. "I work hard all day, and when I get home, you're unable to do anything, not even to cook. Yes, why in the world did I ever get married to you?" I could feel the strain building inside the Mrs. Smith winced at her husband's cramped quarters, fearing what may happen. Harsh remarks, but when she responded to him, "Well, Neil," there was a glimmer of rebellion in her eyes. "Perhaps if you didn't spend, I could have purchased nicer food with all of our money at the bar," and I could have applauded when I heard Mrs. Smith's clever response. But I had witnessed her husband's darker side and knew that he would respond violently to my outrage. His cheeks flushed with rage as he threw his plate to the ground and sprang across the table. Snatching his, the small girl cried and the room fell into chaos as the wife grabbed her by the throat. Turmoil, and I was the only one who could stop Neil's brutal onslaught this time. I tried furiously to pull Neil back, but as soon as my hands touched his body, I experienced a sharp agony. Threw me, and I fell to the ground in pain, paralyzed by something invisible. Neil continued his vicious assault on his wife, knocking her down in the process. Down and encircling her slender neck with his massive hands, strangling her there on the kitchen floor. Unable to move or turn away as the horror played out in front of me. But all of a sudden a new figure appeared with I looked up and saw that Neil was being stabbed in the back with a blade in a frantic attack. Was astounded to see Neil's son holding the knife while his father, crying out, let go of the woman's. He spun around and tried to strike his adolescent son, but he was stabbed in the stomach a second time instead. Neil's massive form fell heavily to the earth, blood streaming from his wounds. I suddenly regained my composure and jumped up and ran to Mrs. Smith's side, but it was already too late. Late, her face a ghastly shade of pale, and she had been choking to death. Her husband's cell killer was still alive, and her lifeless eyes were fixed on the ceiling. But even though he was bleeding profusely from his severe knife wounds, he gazed up at me as he struggled to say his final words before he passed away from bleeding. He spluttered, "But it wasn't me, I have a devil inside of me." But now that I'm at last free of it, I attempted, and my entire body trembled as he choked on his own blood and closed his eyes. Instinctively, I turned to the kids to process the horrific violence I had just seen. I witnessed the sobbing girl being consoled by her older brother, who held out the bleeding object to check if they were wounded. Knife in my direction, threatening me while yelling, "Go damn you, outsider. You came to our house to see her." I stared into the boy's angry eyes and said, "Struggle, you don't belong here. Get out before I kill you too." Eyes and realized he meant it, so I quickly turned around and fled out the door, only to find myself back on the street. I was really ashamed at the time, as I knew Neil's son was correct, and I had worked very hard to get this conclusion. Realm and witness the atrocities it held. I was a visitor here, but others were forced to endure the nightmare. I spotted Billy waiting up there at the end of the street. Me, but the boy stopped making fun of me or torturing me. Instead, he kept his eyes silent. I was saddened to see that his scarf was gone, and that his neck was suddenly marked with a deep red stain. I kept watching as Billy gradually raised his arm and pointed as the heartbreaking tales of the street began to make sense to me. Despite all the horrors I'd already experienced, I was led to the front door of a house at the end of the street. Observed, I felt compelled to investigate whatever was within in the hopes of learning more. Mystery. So I passed Billy with caution, skirting the wall of dense fog in his lifeless gaze. As I approached the house, I noticed that the entrance was already open and that the number indicated 33. When I looked up, I noticed red smoke coming from the house's chimney, and I was hesitant since I thought this was a bad sign, momentarily before going inside, experiencing a chill and considering the possibility that I didn't want to find out what was within. But I compelled myself to do so, as it seemed like my entire voyage had been building to this moment. And I entered another. The little terraced house was furnished as if it had been built in the 1940s, and it led to the small living area where, sitting in front of a crackling fire, an elderly man with white hair and a shaggy, unkempt beard warmed. He read from a book in the tiny room, which I immediately recognized as a copy of the King James Bible. At his side was the white fur of what looked like a full-size wolf matched the owner's beard. When the beast snarled fiercely at me and flashed its teeth, I automatically retreated. But the father used soothing words to quiet his animal. But now, boy, that's not the proper method to handle. The man spoke to me without looking, and our guest the wolf went back to sleep. Up from the nice book, "Welcome, friend, please sit down. I'm curious yet perplexed." So I grabbed a wood-backed chair and sat facing the mysterious elderly man who was closely observing him while he read from his Bible. After a period of silence, he finally spoke and read aloud a passage. "If we confess our sins, he is trustworthy and just to pardon us and purify us of all immorality." Before he shut the book and rose out of his eyes, he nodded slowly, his head seeming to be deep in concentration. Armchair. And then he placed the Bible gently on a bookcase next to the fireplace. I looked up and saw the Quran and other religious and philosophical writings from around the world. Plato's Republic, the Torah, the Vase, and the subfields of Beyond Good and Evil. There were numerous other pieces as well, some of which I knew and others of which I had never heard. Envisioned sacred writings from long extinct faiths and possibly the theories of yet to be discovered future civilizations. Wasn't sure if this enigmatic bearded man was a spirit or a deity who could. In any case, I quickly felt that he had all the answers I was looking for. Humanity has numerous theories, the man explained when he noticed me examining his bookcase. Some people are only half right about the meaning of life and what happens after death, while others are completely incorrect. Fact, only those who have crossed over are aware of it, and they will never return. He gave me a weak smile while looking into my eyes. Looking into his dark, deep eyes for the first time made me feel as though I was, "Oh, my little friend, you've come a long way. A mortal hasn't died in a long time, arrived in this realm, and I have to commend you for your perseverance." I was astounded by the whole circumstance and found it difficult to respond, mumbling, "Thank you, sir." "Where are you?" The man snorted here precisely before responding. "You're a wise young man. I think you already know the response, but allow me to clarify Purgatory Street, as you refer to it. The spirits that reside here make our small realm resemble a halfway house, are neither totally good nor bad. They all committed a grave error in their mortal life, and are currently dealing with the repercussions of their behavior, caught in violent cycles that recur repeatedly over time. Some will succeed some degree of atonement sufficient for them to proceed to the next location, but regrettably I hung on to every word he said, and others will be stuck here forever. Now that everything was starting to make sense, "May I ask who you are?" cautiously asked, and the elderly man chuckled before responding. "My true name would be quite impossible for you to pronounce, and most people think it irrelevant anyhow. I sit here, the gatekeeper, in this brick and mortar house that just so happens to be on the boundary. I try my best to maintain harmony between two realms, but this isn't about me. It's all about you, young man, and what you decide to do next." When I knew that something very significant was about to happen, I felt a chill of anticipation. "You have two options. You can turn around and head back the way you came," the gatekeeper added, "returning to your own domain, or do as I impatiently asked, or you can continue to walk." As I passed over the fog wall and into the following realm, I felt another wave of feelings at the time. Considering how my entire life had been preparing me for this, I questioned, "What's over there?" Visions of the next world are something you have to witness, but it's impossible to put into words. If you cross over with your own eyes, you will witness miracles that surpass your human understanding. But there's a catch. If you decide to enter the immortal realm, you will never be able to return. I gasped in amazement at the realization that I would be leaving the mortal world forever. Advised what to do, I moaned, losing confidence in my options. "I can't make for you. Young man, you have to make a selection fast, as before the sun rises, this realm will change in space and time. Therefore I'm afraid I have to ask you." To abruptly leaving the living room made the mood as unfriendly as the fire crackled and the wolf snarled at me. I began to move away cautiously from the eye, quickly found myself back outside the door as the bearded man gave me a final stare. Purgatory Street and the immortal realm beyond my view were separated by the pavement facing the fog bank. As I prepared to cross and testified to the situation, my nerves were shooting and my entire body trembled with excitement. Wonders beyond, but I stopped at the last second. Suddenly, as my mind was racing with uncertainty, I remembered my family and stopped dead in my tracks. My friends, and although my life at home wasn't ideal, it was what I knew. I had made it this far and was always sure I could go back home, even though the other side was a huge uncertainty. There would be no turning back if I went any further. So what can I say? I choked and lost my nerve and turned around, observing the cobblestones as I walked back down. The door to number 33 was now securely closed. But the other Purgatory inmates, Billy the Kid, went back to being his rebellious self, and the street was there to see me off. He mockingly chuckled and gave me the finger one last time, which only made me feel worse. Humiliated Neil Smith was once again alive and standing outside his home door as he glared at me while clenching his fists. Sally was washing the windows of her magic restored pub when he turned to as I went by. Mr. Rashid was sweeping the sidewalk. Please wink and smile at me. He had a half-crazed smile on his lips as he stood outside his corner store. Wished me a pleasant evening, and lastly, Mavis and Alice. The two local roomers were keeping a close eye on everything that happened at their house while standing at the top of the road. street. I anxiously glanced up as Mavis met my gaze and said, "So long, son, I doubt." As I kept walking, I considered her final words, "We'll meet again." But I peered across to see the pale-faced devil and jumped in terror when I heard a vile cackling coming from number 3. Its black eyes were glowing with fury as it stared out at me, its sharp claws raking against the thin glass window. I sprinted the final few yards in a panic because I was afraid of what the beast would do to me if it got out onto the road. That as soon as I staggered back through the clear gateway and entered my own reality again, I felt a tremendous disappointment when I returned to the dilapidated area as the sun was rising in the distance. When I looked back, I noticed that Purgatory Street had disappeared and had been replaced with the heartbreakingly familiar wasteland littered with trash. And I told you my story because I knew my trip was ended, and this is the first time I've mentioned that my life has deteriorated since I lost it, and it has been several years since my trip to the street. Friends and family members switched between bad jobs and have grown dissatisfied and unfulfilled, and I consider that fatal night every day, wondering what may have been. And I now regret the choice I made at the time after realizing how far in my quest for knowledge just to suddenly lose my composure, yet it won't occur once more. I go back there each night in the vain hope that Purgatory Street will return and give me the opportunity to cross across. I've had years of disappointment, but eventually my perseverance will be rewarded and I'll walk the street once more, and I won't be returning this time. Good luck, friends.